A lot of people still remind me. I heard him, and some say they cry because the Red Sox haven't won in so long. But I got to do my job, and I hit the homer. I hit the home run to close the game. I mean, get the goal closer, and then we win the seventh game.
Hates me sick. That sounds like something a bitter old ballplayer might say about a rival he never got over. It sounds like the start of a real grudge story. But look closer. Just days before Pete Rose died in September 2024, Tony Pérez stood right next to him at a card signing in Nashville. That is not what hate looks like. That is what loyalty looks like, right to the end. So if Tony Pérez did not hate Pete Rose, why does a headline claim he named 6 players he will never forgive? The truth is stranger than the headline. It is not a clean list of enemies. It is a mess of mixed up names, computer errors, and real hurt that never came from a grudge list at all. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Today we dig into the strange story behind that headline. We will find out where it really came from, and it is not what you think. And if this story already feels bigger than a simple baseball grudge, give this video some hype, because the deeper we go, the more that headline starts to fall apart. Tony Pérez was never known as a man who held grudges. He was known by 2 nicknames, Big Dog and Doggy. Both names came from teammates who saw him as warm, steady, and easy to trust. He was the kind of player who kept a locker room calm when things got tense. He was the quiet center of some of the greatest teams in baseball history. So when a title shows up online claiming he named 6 players he will never forgive, something does not add up. That Nashville signing tells the real story better than any list ever could. Pete Rose spent decades banned from baseball. Many old friends kept their distance once his gambling scandal broke. Tony Pérez did not. He stayed close to Rose for the rest of his life. He showed up beside him near the very end. The man who truly could not forgive does not stand next to his old friend for a photo days before that friend passes away. He does that because the friendship never broke in the first place. So where did this grudge story come from? It did not come from Tony Pérez himself. It came from somewhere else entirely, and once you see where, you will understand why so many sports headlines like this one cannot be trusted at face value. The real story is not about hate. It is about how the internet builds fake anger out of real names, and how a beloved legend became the face of a grudge he never held. Across sports media today, there is a pattern that shows up again and again. Videos claim that a famous athlete named a list of people they will never forgive. You have probably seen the same formula used for golfers, for old boxers, for basketball legends. The titles all sound the same. The A, big name, a number, and the word forgive. It is built to make you click, because anger and betrayal pull people in faster than a calm story ever could. Here's the problem. Most of these lists are not real confessions. They are built after the fact using search engines instead of interviews. The A computer program looks for a famous name, then looks for any page online that uses words like forgive, rival, or grudge anywhere near that name. It just grabs pieces and stitches them together into a headline that sounds like a quote. That is likely what happened here. Tony Pérez never said he would never forgive 6 players. No interview backs it up. No teammate ever repeated such a quote. Instead, a title formula that has already been used for other athletes got pointed at his name, and the internet filled in the rest. This matters because Tony Pérez is exactly the kind of name this formula works well on. He is famous enough that people recognize him instantly. He is tied to a legendary team, the Big Red Machine, so his name shows up in thousands of articles and forum posts. And because he is well known but rarely controversial, there was an empty space where a fake controversy could be dropped in without anyone noticing right away. There's something uncomfortable buried in that. The quiet, respected legend can actually become an easier target for this kind of trick than a loud, controversial one. When a person never publicly fights, argues, or feuds, there is no real record to contradict a fake story. Nobody has to disprove 6 specific insults, because Tony Pérez never gave anyone a reason to expect any. His silence, built from decades of being a calm and steady presence, left room for the internet to invent a version of him that never existed. Think about how strange that is. The man spends an entire career avoiding personal feuds, staying loyal to teammates, and holding a locker room together. Decades later, that same reputation for staying quiet becomes the very thing that lets a fake grudge story attach itself to his name with almost nothing pushing back. The nicer and calmer the public record, the easier it becomes for a headline to fill in whatever story gets the most clicks. So before we even get to where this 6-player claim actually came from, it helps to understand that the claim was never checked against Tony Pérez's real life at all. It was built the way way a lot of modern content gets built, by chasing keywords instead of chasing the truth. And once you see how that machine works, the next part of the story gets even stranger, because the name Tony Pérez does not only belong to one person online. This same formula shows up across dozens of other sports figures, not just Tony Pérez. Golfer Lee Trevino has had a similar video circulate about golfers he will supposedly never forgive. Baseball legend Yogi Berra has been hit with the same treatment, tied to 7 fellow legends. Even Tiger Woods has had a version of this exact title format attached to his name, claiming he named 6 golfers he will never forgive. Once you notice the pattern, it becomes obvious. These are not real confessions from real athletes. They are a template reused again and again, with a new famous name dropped in each time. Here is something most people never think about. Tony Pérez is not a rare name. He belongs to more than one real person, and those separate lives got mixed together online until they formed one false character. Start with the man this whole story is actually about. The Atanasio Tony Pérez Regal, the Hall of Fame first baseman, spent his career with the Cincinnati Reds and later worked in baseball as a coach, manager, and team executive. He is the central figure people picture when they hear the name, but he is far from the only Tony Pérez that search engines have on file. There is Oliver Pérez, a pitcher who spent 20 years in Major League Baseball. He has no direct connection to Tony Pérez, the Hall of Famer, other than sharing part of a surname. But that shared surname mattered more than you would expect, because Oliver Pérez is tied to a completely different piece of the puzzle, a video game statistic involving the number 6. We will come back to that shortly. There is also a Tony Pérez who has nothing to do with baseball at all. He is a Filipino author and modernist playwright, known for his writing and his work as a psychologist. Years ago, he wrote personal essays about stepping back from social media. In one of them, he talked about unfriending people online, and he used the word forgive while explaining his choice to disconnect from old contacts. His words had nothing to do with sports, but once that page exists online next to the name Tony Pérez, a search engine can pull it into the same digital pile as everything else carrying that name. Then there is a very different, very painful example. A man named Antonio Tony Pérez worked as a psychiatric nursing assistant in Kerrville, Texas. He passed away in 2023. In the online guest book for his memorial, his daughter wrote a message saying she would not be able to forgive for a long time because losing her father hurt so deeply. That message was written from grief, not anger, at some list of rivals. It had nothing to do with baseball and nothing to do with Tony Pérez, the ball player. But her heartfelt words used the exact words search engines look for, the name Tony Pérez sitting right next to the word forgive. There is also a Tony Pérez who worked for years as a boxing referee during one of the sport's biggest eras. He is remembered for officiating major heavyweight fights, including matches connected to Muhammad Ali. Reviews and articles about controversial moments in the ring sometimes carry his name alongside words like mistake and controversy, adding one more thread to the tangled search results. And finally, in a much darker case, a man named Tony Pérez was convicted in a federal murder-for-hire case, tied to a plot against someone described in court records as a rival. That case has absolutely nothing to do with baseball. But once again, the words rival and grudge sit right next to the name Tony Pérez in official documents that search engines can find and index. None of these people are the same person. The Hall of Fame first baseman, a modern pitcher, a Filipino author, a grieving daughter's tribute to her father, a boxing referee, and a convicted criminal all share a name or part of one, and nothing else. But a search engine does not understand family history or personal identity the way a human does. It reads text. It sees a name. It sees emotional words like forgive and rival sitting nearby. Then it treats all of that as one connected story. This is how 6 unrelated threads about 6 different people got folded into a single false idea. Somewhere in that mixing, the phrase 6 players got pulled in too, mostly from a completely unrelated source involving a video game. Put those pieces together, run them through a content formula built to create clickable headlines, and you get a title like Tony Pérez names 6 MLB players he will never forgive. Sounds specific? It sounds like a real quote, but it was never spoken by anyone. It was built piece by piece out of strangers who happen to share a name. It helps to picture how a search engine actually works here. It does not read a page the way a person does, understanding context, tone, or who is really being talked about. It scans for patterns. 8 notices that a page contains the words Tony and Pérez. 8 notices that a nearby sentence contains the word forgive. Stores that connection as a data point. Do that across thousands of pages involving 6 or more separate men who happen to share a name, and you end up with a tangled web of unrelated forgive-related content, all technically linked to the same 2 words. Tony Pérez, None of the 6 people described here ever crossed paths with one another. The Hall of Fame first baseman never met the Filipino author. The grieving daughter in Texas never had any connection to the boxing referee. The convicted criminal has nothing to do with the modern pitcher who shares part of a surname. Yet a search algorithm, built to find patterns rather than understand truth, effectively treated all of these separate lives as chapters in one story. That is the quiet danger of automated content. It does not lie on purpose. It simply cannot tell the difference between 6 different men and one complicated one. Now let us leave the internet mix-up behind and look at the real conflict in Tony Perez's life, the one that actually deserves the word grudge. It did not involve 6 players. It involved one general manager, and it happened fast. In 1993, Tony Perez was given the job every Reds fan wanted for him. He became the manager of the Cincinnati Reds, the team where he had built his whole legend as a player. It felt like the perfect ending to a loyal career. But it did not last long, and it did not end the way anyone expected. The team started slowly. After a rough road trip out west, the Reds sat at 20 wins and 24 losses. That record was not great, but it was still early in the season, and plenty of managers have turned around slower starts than that. Nobody expected what came next. At 7 in the morning on May 24th, 1993, the phone rang in Tony Perez's home. It was general manager Jim Bowden. Perez was still asleep. Bowden woke him up and fired him right there over the phone. No face-to-face conversation. No chance to defend his early season record in person. Just a phone call before sunrise, ending a job that had barely started. Perez had managed only 44 games. Baseball historians point out that this was the fastest a first-year manager had been fired in 65 years. Think about that. 6.5 decades of baseball history, and no rookie manager had ever been let go that quickly. For a franchise icon, a man who gave the Reds decades of loyalty as a player, it was a stunning and humiliating way to be shown the door. The reaction inside the organization was immediate. The Ron Oster, who was serving as first base coach and had once been Perez's teammate, resigned from his own job in protest. He would not stay on staff for a team that treated Tony Perez that way. That single decision tells you how deeply this firing was felt inside the clubhouse, not just among fans watching from home. The pain did not stop there. Years later, in 2000, Jim Bowden reportedly offered Ron Oster the job of Reds manager. Theo Oster was ready to accept, then Bowden changed course and hired Bob Boone instead, without ever properly following through on his own offer. That second betrayal permanently ended any chance of forgiveness between the two men. Theo Oster carried real, lasting anger toward Bowden for the rest of his career. Not because of 6 mystery players, but because of 2 specific broken promises from one specific man. That is the part of this story worth sitting with. If anyone in this saga actually held a grudge that never healed, it was not Tony Perez against a list of players. It was Ron Oster against Jim Bowden, born from watching his friend and former teammate get fired at dawn over a phone call, then getting burned by the same man years later. The firing followed Perez for the rest of his life in quieter ways too. In May of 2000, the Reds retired his uniform number 24 in a ceremony meant to honor everything he had given the franchise as a player. Jim Bowden did not attend. The Bowden later admitted that his presence would have only reminded everyone in the stadium of the way he ended Perez's managing career 7 years earlier. The staying away, in his own words, was the only respectful choice left to him. So picture that moment, the A stadium full of fans cheering for a legend, celebrating everything good about his career while the man who fired him sat somewhere else entirely. The aware that just showing up would have turned a tribute into a reminder of one of the ugliest decisions in franchise history. That absence says more about the real hurt in this story than any fake list of enemies ever could. None of this proves Tony Perez held a grudge against 6 players. It proves something more complicated. It proves that even a legend, loved by fans and respected across the sport, could be treated as disposable by the business side of baseball. The real anger in this story belonged to the people around him, the coach who quit in protest, the fans who never forgot, the in the front office executive who could not even show his face at a jersey retirement without feeling the weight of what he had done. Consider what Tony Perez had already given the Cincinnati Reds by the time that phone rang. He had spent his entire playing career building the identity of that franchise, anchoring a lineup that won back-to-back championships and representing everything fans loved about the team. Handing him the manager's job in 1993 was supposed to be a reward for that loyalty, a chance to lead the organization he had helped define as a player. Instead, it became one of the shortest and most painful chapters of his entire baseball life, over almost as quickly as it began. There is one more detail that explains why the firing happened when it did, and it involves a sports writer, not a player. The Hal McCoy was a respected baseball writer, later inducted into the writers' wing of the Hall of Fame. During that rocky 1993 season, McCoy mentioned something to Perez in passing. He pointed out that catcher Joe Oliver had a strong history of hitting well against a specific opposing pitcher, Bud Black of the San Francisco Giants. Perez had had planned to start a different catcher that day, Dan Wilson. After hearing what McCoy said, Pérez changed his mind and started Joe Oliver instead. On its own, that sounds like a small, reasonable decision. The managers adjust lineups based on matchups all the time, but Jim Bowden apparently saw it differently. According to the reporting, Bowden viewed the lineup change as a sign that his manager could be pushed around by a conversation with a reporter rather than sticking to his own plan. Bowden, it looked like weakness at a moment when he was already unhappy with the team's slow start. Whether that reaction was fair is a separate question. A quick chat with a trusted writer about a matchup is a normal part of baseball. Managers gather information from all kinds of sources before making lineup decisions. But fair or not, that moment reportedly became part of what pushed Bowden toward making the call that ended Pérez's job only days later. It is worth pausing on how strange that is. The legend of the franchise, a man who had given the Reds his entire playing career, lost his managing job partly because of a passing comment about a backup catcher's batting history. It was not a scandal. It was not a fight. It was not disloyalty. It was one small decision, magnified into a reason for dismissal by a general manager who was already looking for one. This detail matters because it shows how fragile Pérez's position really was, even with everything he had given the organization. His playing legacy could not protect him from being judged over a single lineup choice. The same quiet, easygoing nature that made him beloved as a player may have made it easier for Bowden to move against him as a manager without the kind of public backlash that might have come firing a louder, the more combative figure. So when you look at the pieces together, the phone call at dawn, the resignation of a loyal coach, the years-long silence at a jersey retirement, and a lineup change over a backup catcher, you get a much clearer picture of what real institutional conflict looked like in Tony Pérez's career. It was not personal hatred aimed at rivals. It was a franchise treating a legend as replaceable over decisions far smaller than his decades of service deserved. It is a strange kind of lesson buried inside this story. In modern baseball, information sharing between reporters and coaching staff happens constantly, and good managers are usually praised for staying open to new information rather than punished for it. Yet in this one case, an ordinary piece of scouting insight, the kind managers hear from writers, coaches, and advanced scouts all the time, became a small crack in the relationship between Pérez and his general manager. The right, when that relationship was already under pressure from a slow start to the season. The Bowden firing was not the only time Tony Pérez found out that respect in baseball does not always protect you from being pushed aside. More than 20 years later, it happened again, this time with the Miami Marlins. After his playing days, Pérez had built a long second career in baseball as a special assistant to the general manager for the Marlins. He held that role for almost 25 years, becoming a familiar and trusted presence around the organization, someone younger players and staff could learn from. In late 2017, everything changed. The new ownership group took control of the Marlins, led by Derek Jeter as chief executive officer. Jeter directed the outgoing team president, David Sampson, to clear out several long-standing figures from the organization. That list included Tony Pérez, fellow Hall of Famer Andre Dawson, longtime executive Jeff Conine, and former World Series winning manager Jack McKeon. Think about who was on that list. These were not underperforming employees. These were some of the most respected names in franchise history, men who had given decades of loyalty and knowledge to the organization. Cutting all four of them at once, right as new ownership took over, sent a clear message about how the new leadership viewed the past. The backlash was immediate and loud. Fans and sports writers across the country criticized the decision publicly. Many said openly that they would never forgive Jeter and the new ownership group for the way they treated legends of the game. That phrase, never forgive, actually shows up in real coverage of this moment, tied to real anger from real people watching how these men were let go. Facing that pressure, Jeter reversed course. He personally reached out to all four men, described the firings as a misunderstanding, and offered them smaller, reduced advisory roles instead of a clean break. On the surface, that looked like an attempt to make things right, but reporting at the time described Tony Pérez as thoroughly upset by how the entire situation had been handled, even after the offer to stay on in a lesser role. Notice the pattern forming here. Once again, it was not Tony Pérez naming enemies or refusing to forgive anyone publicly. It was the people around him, fans, reporters, and commentators, who used the language of never forgiving on his behalf. He experienced the disrespect, the other people supplied the outrage. There is something worth sitting with in that. Twice in his life, once as a manager in 1993 and again as an executive in 2017, Tony Pérez was treated as replaceable by the very organizations he had given decades of loyalty to, but both times it was not really about performance. In 1993, it was about a general manager's impatience and a misread lineup decision. In 2017, it was about new ownership wanting a clean slate without much regard for what these men had built over their careers. Pérez never turned either moment into a public feud. He did not go on record naming Manning, Bowden, or Jeter as men he would never forgive. He simply carried the disrespect quietly, the same way he carried nearly everything else in his long career. That quiet response is part of why this story keeps getting hijacked by fake headlines. The A man who stays calm and does not fight back publicly leaves a gap that other people and eventually algorithms are more than happy to fill with words he never actually said. Consider the timing, too. This purge happened right as new ownership wanted to make a fresh impression on the franchise. Instead of leaning on institutional knowledge from men who had spent decades inside the organization, the new leadership chose a clean break first and only reconsidered once the public reaction turned sharply negative. That order of events says something important. The initial decision was not about performance or wrongdoing. It was about optics and control until the backlash forced a correction. So far, every real conflict in this story has come from front offices and general managers, not from other players. But that does not mean Tony Pérez never faced real heat on the field. He did. He just handled it the way he handled everything else, as part of the game, not as the start of a lifelong. Go back to July 3rd, 1967. The Reds were facing the St. Louis Cardinals, and on the mound for St. Louis stood Bob Gibson, one of the most intimidating pitchers in baseball history. Gibson threw a fastball high and tight, right near Pérez's head. That kind of pitch is meant to send a message, and Pérez understood exactly what message it was sending. Words were exchanged after the pitch. Teammate Orlando Cepeda stepped in to try to calm things down, but instead the situation exploded into a massive bench-clearing brawl. This was not a small scuffle. Reports from that day described 25 players being injured, along with a police officer who ended up needing hospital treatment trying to break things up. In the middle of the chaos, Gibson found himself fighting inside the Cincinnati dugout against 3 Reds players at once: Tony Pérez, Pete Rose, and Tommy Helms. That is about as real as a baseball rivalry gets. The fists, a packed dugout, dozens of players involved. But even that moment did not turn into a lasting personal grudge that followed Pérez for the rest of his career. It was treated the way most old-school baseball brawls were treated, as a heated physical part of a hard-fought game, not the seed of an enemy's list. 6 years later, in the 1973 National League Championship Series, another dramatic moment unfolded, though this time Pérez played more of a peacekeeping role than a combatant. The Pete Rose executed a hard physical slide into New York Mets shortstop Bud Harrelson at second base, and the two ended up wrestling on the ground. Benches cleared again. This time, Pérez worked alongside Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan to help manage the chaos and keep the situation from spiraling further out of control. It is a small but telling detail. In a moment other teammates were creating conflict, Pérez was one of the players trying to hold things together. Then came one of the most famous swings of his entire career. During Game 7 of the 1975 World Series against the Boston Red Sox, Boston pitcher Bill Lee, nicknamed Spaceman for his unconventional style, tried something unusual against Pérez. He threw a slow, looping pitch known as the leafus, hoping to catch Pérez off balance and disrupt his timing. Did not work. Pérez read the pitch, adjusted, and drove it over the left field wall for a 2-run home run. That swing shifted the momentum of the game and helped push the Reds toward their first World Series championship in 35 years. It remains one of the signature moments of his career, proof that when the competitive stakes were highest, Tony Pérez delivered under pressure rather than looking for a fight. Put these moments side by side, and a clear pattern appears. Tony Pérez was not soft. He stood his ground against one of the most feared pitchers in the game. Threw punches when a brawl broke out around him. But he also worked to calm chaos when his own teammates started it, and his biggest highlight came from staying composed under a pitcher's trick play rather than losing his temper. None of these moments produced a private list of enemies. They produced respect. The opposing players who battled Pérez on the field during the 60s and 70s generally spoke about him afterward with admiration, not bitterness. The brawls were part of an era where baseball was simply played rougher and more physically than it is today. They were competitive fire, not personal hatred carried for decades. If anything, these stories work against the fake grudge narrative even more than they support it, because they show a man who fought hard in the moment and then let it go. It is worth remembering the era these moments happened. The baseball in the 1960s and 70s looked very different from the game played today. Brushback pitches near a batter's head were far more common. The hard slides that ended in wrestling matches were treated as a normal part of playoff intensity. The bench-clearing brawls, while still shocking, were not the rare, headline-dominating events they are now. Judging Tony Pérez's fights and physical clashes by today's standards misses the point entirely. These moments were simply what competitive baseball looked like at the time, and Pérez met that standard without letting it define who he was once the game ended. Now let us look at where the number 6 actually comes from in Tony Pérez's real career, because there is more than one true 6-player group hiding behind this fake headline. The first one comes from a video game. Baseball fans and gamers have talked talked for years about MVP Baseball 2005, a game widely remembered as one of the best baseball video games ever made. The historians of the game like to point out the final 6 players from that roster who were still active in the major leagues years later. That group includes Oliver Pérez, Scott Kazmir, Zach Greinke, Yadier Molina, Miguel Cabrera, and Albert Pujols. Notice the name Oliver Pérez sitting right at the front of that list. The search engine skimming for the words Perez and 6 players could easily grab this list, strip away the first name Oliver, and quietly attach the number 6 to Tony Perez instead, who played left field and served as designated hitter. The Rice hit 382 home runs, collected 2,452 hits, and drove in 1,451 runs. He entered the Hall of Fame in 2009. The number 2 is Dwight Evans, a right fielder known for his power and his glove. The Evans finished with 385 home runs, 2,446 hits, and 1,384 runs batted in, and has remained a serious Hall of Fame nominee for years. The number 1 is Carl Yastrzemski, who played left field and first base. The Yastrzemski hit an incredible 452 home runs, collected 3,419 hits, and drove in 1,844 runs across his career. He entered the Hall of Fame in 1989 as one of the most decorated hitters of his era. 6 sluggers, 1 roster, and Tony Perez sitting right in the middle of that group. When automated systems scan for pages mentioning Tony Perez, 6 players, and Red Sox altogether, it is easy to see how a statistical cluster like this one could get twisted into a fake list of personal enemies. The number 6 was never about hate, it was about home runs. Beyond that Red Sox connection, Tony Perez is most remembered for a completely different lineup, one that has nothing to do with grudges and everything to do with greatness. Fans call it the Great Eight. The starting lineup of the Cincinnati Reds during their championship years in 1975 and 1976. That lineup included Joe Morgan at second base, Pete Rose at third base and in the outfield, Johnny Bench behind the plate, Tony Perez at first base, George Foster in left field, Dave Concepcion at shortstop, Ken Griffey Sr. in right field, and Cesar Geronimo in center field. Baseball historians still study this group as one of the most efficient, powerful, and well-rounded lineups the sport has ever produced. Here is where the story gets a little more complicated and a little more honest. When analysts look purely at advanced statistics, specifically a measurement called wins above replacement, Tony Perez actually ranks as the lowest among the Hall of Fame members of the Great Eight. Joe Morgan's career number sits above 100. B. Pete Rose sits near 80. Johnny Bench sits above 75. Perez, by comparison, finished around 54. That gap might surprise people who remember him as one of the most feared hitters of his era. But numbers only tell part of the story, and the players who actually shared a clubhouse with him tell a different one. Teammates and managers consistently pointed to his ability to drive in runs when it mattered most, and to the calm, steady presence he brought to a team full of enormous personalities and even bigger egos. Over the course of his career, Perez drove in 1,652 runs, a total that still ranks 32nd all-time in Major League history. His durability matched his consistency. Perez played 23 seasons in the major leagues, an extraordinary length of time for any player. That longevity produced one final unforgettable moment. In 1985, at 42 years old, Perez hit a grand slam off Philadelphia pitcher Dave Rucker. That made him the oldest player in Major League history to hit a grand slam, a record that spoke to just how long he had remained a dangerous hitter, long after most players his age had retired. So here's the honest tension in his legacy. The advanced statistics suggest he was the least dominant Hall of Famer among his own famous teammates. But eye test, the memory of teammates, and the weight of his run production tell a story of a player whose value never fully showed up in one single number. That gap between memory and metrics is a real and fair thing to question about his legacy. It is a far more interesting conversation than a fake list of 6 enemies, because it is actually true, and it shows that even legends carry complicated, debatable legacies rather than perfect, uncomplicated ones. Looking at the full lineup side by side shows just how loaded that Great Eight really was. Joe Morgan finished with a career wins above replacement over 100, hit a peak of 11 in his MVP season of 1975, batted 271 for his career, and won 2 National League MVP awards along with 5 Gold Gloves. The Pete Rose posted a career figure near 80, batted 303 for his career, and won 3 batting titles along with an MVP award of his own. Johnny Bench sat above 75, batted 267, and claimed 2 MVP awards, plus 10 Gold Gloves behind the plate. George Foster contributed a career figure over 44, batted batted .274 and delivered a monster 1,977 season with 52 home runs and the National League MVP award. Dave Concepcion added over 40, batted .267, and earned 5 Gold Gloves along with 9 All-Star selections at shortstop. Ken Griffey Sr. posted a career figure near 34.5, batted .296, and won 2 championships as part of this core group. Cesar Geronimo rounded out the lineup defensively, batting .258 while winning 4 Gold Gloves patrolling center field. The set against those numbers, Tony Perez's career figure of 54 does sit at the bottom of that particular list. They do not measure the trust teammates placed in him during a tight game. They do not measure the calm he brought to a clubhouse filled with future Hall of Famers and enormous personalities. The advanced statistics are a genuinely useful tool for understanding a player's value, but they were never designed to measure leadership, timing, or the quiet consistency of a man who simply kept delivering runs year after year for over 2 decades. So let's go back to where we started. Tony Perez did not leave behind a list of 6 players he could never forgive. That list was never real. The stronger, truer story is that other people did the not forgiving on his behalf. The fans never forgave Jim Bowden for that early morning phone call in 1993. Theron Oster never forgave Bowden for breaking a second promise years later. Fans and writers never forgave Derek Jeter and Marlins ownership for how they treated 4 legends at once in 2017. Search engines never bothered to keep 6 different men named Tony Perez separate from each other. Through it all, the real Tony Perez stayed remarkably consistent. He was big dog. He was doggy. He was the calm center of the big red machine, a fierce competitor when the moment called for it, and a loyal friend until the very end, standing beside Pete Rose just days before Rose passed away. The headline promised hate. The real story, once you clear away the noise, is one of loyalty that never broke, even when baseball itself did not always return the favor.